Every weekday morning, at exactly 7:30, bus number 12 reached the Maple Street stop. The timetable said the doors should close immediately after every passenger was safely on board. The route was carefully planned. Every minute mattered. Passengers expected it. The city measured it. And yet, every single morning the bus waited. Not for 5 minutes. Not even one. Exactly 30 seconds. Some passengers smiled. Others glanced impatiently at their watches. A few quietly wondered why the driver couldn't simply follow the schedule. After all, rules were rules, weren't they? Then, just as the 30 seconds came to an end, an elderly man appeared around the corner, walking as quickly as his wooden cane allowed. The bus doors remained open. The driver smiled. "Good morning, Harold." Harold caught his breath. "Morning, Walter." The doors closed. The bus pulled away, exactly 30 seconds after the scheduled departure, just as it had almost every weekday for the last 2 years. Nobody aboard bus number 12 knew what had happened only moments earlier. A little girl had climbed onto her yellow school bus. She had waved enthusiastically through the window. Her grandfather had waited until the bus disappeared safely around the corner. Only then had he turned and hurried toward the bus stop on Maple Street, as quickly as 82-year-old legs would carry him. Walter never asked Harold to explain. He already knew. Some moments were worth 30 seconds. One Monday morning, a formal complaint arrived at the transit office. By Friday, there were 4. The reports all said the same thing. Driver consistently leaves Maple Street 30 seconds late. The operations department opened an investigation, because sometimes the smallest delay raises the biggest questions. Walter Hayes had been driving buses for 35 years. In all that time, he had never received a serious complaint. No preventable accidents. No safety violations. No missed inspections. His record was almost impossible to improve. Yet every morning he knowingly ignored one instruction: the departure time at Maple Street. He didn't ignore it carelessly. Quite the opposite. He knew the timetable by heart. He could have recited every stop from memory, but he believed that a timetable should serve people, not the other way around. At 6:45, Walter began every shift exactly the same way. He walked once around the bus, checked the tires, the lights, the mirrors, tested the wheelchair ramp, then climbed into the driver's seat. After everything was ready, he would take a small folded photograph from his wallet. It showed his father standing proudly beside an old city bus. Walter smiled. "Morning, Dad." The photograph disappeared back into his wallet. The engine started. Another day began. By 7:28, Walter could already see Maple Street in the distance. He glanced briefly into the large rear-view mirror. Several regular passengers looked up from their newspapers. One young nurse smiled politely. A university student adjusted his headphones. A mother helped her little son to fasten his backpack. Almost everyone on the bus knew what would happen next. Walter gently stopped beside the curb. The doors opened. Several passengers climbed aboard. During the previous month, the new Maple Heights neighborhood had finally opened. Since then, more people had begun using bus number 12 every morning. Everyone was aboard already. Several unfamiliar faces looked curiously toward the driver. No one else appeared. Walter looked once toward the corner of Oak Avenue, then quietly rested both hands on the steering wheel. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. No one aboard complained. This happened every morning. Most passengers had long ago accepted that it was part of the journey. Some had even stopped checking their watches. Then, at almost exactly the same moment every weekday, Harold appeared. walking briskly with his cane, one hand holding his hat against the morning breeze, the other gripping the polished wooden handle. Walter smiled. "Good morning." Harold smiled back. Emma got full marks in spelling. Walter's face brightened. "Did she?" Harold nodded proudly. "She wanted to tell me before her school bus came." Walter chuckled. "Sounds like 30 seconds well spent." Laughter rippled gently through the front of the bus. Even the young nurse smiled. Harold took his usual seat near the front. Walter quietly closed the doors, then eased the bus back into traffic. Exactly 30 seconds after the scheduled departure. Not a second more. Not a second less. Across town, Rebecca Collins was reading the latest performance report. One route immediately caught her attention. Route 12. On-time performance. Excellent. Except one stop. Maple Street. Average delay. 30 seconds. Every weekday. Precisely. Without exception. Rebecca frowned. 30 seconds wasn't an accident. It was a decision. She looked toward the office window, then closed the report. "I think I'll ride Route 12 tomorrow." The following morning, Rebecca left her office much earlier than usual. Instead of reviewing reports, she boarded bus number 12. She chose a seat halfway down the aisle, close enough to observe, far enough away not to disturb the driver. Walter greeted her with the same warm smile he offered every passenger. "Good morning." "Morning." He didn't ask why she was there. He already knew. The bus rolled quietly through the waking town. Walter greeted people by name. "Morning, Mrs. Lewis." "Good luck with your interview, Ethan." "How's your shoulder today, Mr. Patel?" Rebecca quietly noticed each conversation. None lasted more than a few seconds. Yet every passenger smiled before taking a seat. She found herself thinking of another leader she had once met. Someone who believed that people remembered being noticed. By 7:28, Walter eased the bus toward Maple Street. Rebecca glanced at her watch, then at the dashboard clock. Perfectly on schedule. Walter opened the doors. Passengers stepped aboard. The stop became quiet. Rebecca expected the doors to close. They didn't. Walter calmly rested both hands on the steering wheel. He looked toward the corner, where Oak Avenue met Maple Street. Waiting. Rebecca made a note. 7:30. Bus stationary. Then she looked up. An elderly man appeared around the corner, walking briskly with his cane. Not wandering, not distracted. Purposeful. Trying. Walter smiled. "Good morning, Harold." Harold caught his breath. "Morning." Walter glanced toward the street behind Harold. "The school bus on time today?" Harold smiled. "Almost to the second." Walter nodded. "I saw it." Rebecca looked through the windscreen. Far down Oak Avenue, she could see the little yellow school bus disappearing around the bend. Only now did Walter close the doors. The bus pulled away. Rebecca wrote another note, then stopped. Instead, she looked out of the window. The whole thing had lasted barely half a minute. At the end of the route, she approached Walter. "I'd like you to leave Maple Street exactly on time tomorrow." Walter nodded immediately. "Of course." She was almost surprised. "No discussion?" Walter smiled gently. "You've asked me to follow the timetable. That's your job." She nodded. "And yours." Walter smiled. "Yes." No complaint. No argument. Only quiet agreement. The next morning, Rebecca stood on the opposite side of Maple Street. She wanted to observe without being on the bus. Bus number 12 arrived. Exactly on time. Walter opened the doors. Passengers boarded. He looked once toward Oak Avenue. Then, for the first time in 2 years, He gently closed the doors. The bus pulled away. Exactly at 7:30. 30 seconds later, Harold appeared. He stopped, looked toward the empty road. For a long moment he simply stood there. His shoulders dropped. Not in anger. Only quiet disappointment. He looked at his watch. The next bus would arrive almost 20 minutes later. Rebecca watched him. She expected him to turn around. He didn't. He quietly sat down on the bench, folded his hands over the handle of his cane, and waited. Something about the scene troubled her. Not because Harold blamed anyone. He didn't. He simply accepted it, almost as though disappointing mornings were something life had taught him to expect. Rebecca crossed the street. "Good morning." Harold looked up. "Morning. I'm Rebecca Collins." He smiled politely. "The new operations manager." She nodded. "I hope you don't mind me asking, where are you traveling today?" Harold smiled. "The same place I go every day." "And where is that?" He looked down the road where the bus had disappeared. "I'm visiting my wife." Rebecca waited quietly. He continued. "She has Alzheimer's." A gentle pause. "She doesn't always remember my name." His smile remained. "But she usually remembers breakfast." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. "I try to arrive before they clear the trays." He looked once more toward the empty road. "I'll probably miss it today." Neither of them spoke. The morning traffic passed quietly. Finally, Harold smiled. "It isn't Walter's fault. He was only following the timetable." He didn't complain. He didn't shake his head. He simply waited. Rebecca sat down beside him. "I'm sorry." Harold smiled kindly. "For what?" "I asked Walter to leave exactly on time." Harold nodded slowly. "I thought you might have." She looked surprised. "You did?" He smiled. "Walter has never missed me before." A gentle pause. When something changes, there's usually a reason. For a few moments they watched the morning traffic together. Finally, Rebecca asked, "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why don't you catch an earlier school bus with Emma?" Harold smiled. "There isn't one." Rebecca frowned slightly. "No?" He gently shook his head. "The school district changed the routes 2 years ago. Emma's bus now comes at 7:27. He looked toward the corner, where the yellow bus had disappeared. "My bus still leaves at 7:30. Rebecca quietly did the calculation in her head. 3 minutes. For someone walking with a cane, it simply wasn't enough time. Harold smiled gently. "I've never asked Walter to wait." Rebecca looked at him. "I know. He started doing it on his own." Another quiet pause. "I told him not to." "You did?" Harold nodded. "I didn't want to inconvenience everyone else." Rebecca smiled faintly. "And what did Walter say?" Harold laughed softly. He said, "We'll see how many people 30 seconds inconveniences." Rebecca couldn't help smiling. "That sounds like him." Harold nodded. "It does." Just then a city bus turned the corner. Not Walter's. The next service. Harold slowly stood. Before boarding, he looked back at Rebecca. "I hope you don't think badly of Walter." She shook her head immediately. "No." A small pause. "I think I'm beginning to understand him." Harold smiled. Rebecca didn't return to the office immediately. Instead, she drove to Rosewood Care Home, the address Harold had quietly mentioned. She introduced herself at the reception desk. "I'm looking for Margaret Benson." The receptionist smiled warmly. "Harold's wife?" Rebecca nodded. "He's usually here by 8. The receptionist glanced at the clock. "Not today." A gentle smile faded from her face. "He'll miss breakfast." Rebecca looked through the dining room window. Several elderly residents were already eating. One woman sat quietly at a small table near the window. She looked toward the entrance every few seconds, almost expectantly. The receptionist followed Rebecca's gaze. "That's Margaret." Rebecca remained silent. The receptionist smiled sadly. Some mornings she remembers everything. Some mornings she remembers almost nothing. A gentle pause. But she nearly always remembers that someone comes to have breakfast with her. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. When Harold arrives, what happens? The receptionist smiled. She smiles. And for 20 or 30 minutes, they're simply husband and wife again. Rebecca stood quietly by the window, watching Margaret glance once more toward the entrance. She wasn't watching the clock. She was waiting for someone she loved. For the first time since becoming operations manager, Rebecca stopped thinking about departure times. Instead, she found herself asking a different question. What is public transport really for? To move buses, or to help people reach the moments that matter most? That afternoon, she opened Walter's route file once again. This time, she wasn't looking at delays. She was looking at connections. One yellow school bus, one city bus, one nursing home breakfast. 3 separate schedules that somehow met every weekday morning for exactly 30 seconds. The following morning, Rebecca arrived at the depot before sunrise. She carried Walter's route file under one arm, a notebook under the other. For the first time, she ignored the performance graphs. Instead, she began writing names. Harold, Emma, Margaret. Then she stopped. After a moment, she added another, writing, "Who else?" Later that morning, she rode Route 12 once again. This time, she wasn't watching the dashboard clock. She was watching the passengers. At the third stop, a young nurse climbed aboard. Walter smiled. "Morning, Rachel." She smiled back. "Morning." Rebecca noticed the tired circles beneath her eyes. Night shift. A few stops later, Walter quietly asked, "Everything all right today?" Rachel nodded. "Better." Walter smiled. "I'm glad." The bus followed East Route and left Maple Street Station at 7:30, as was written down in his timetable. Rebecca waited until Rachel left the bus, got off herself behind Rachel. Then she introduced herself. "I'm Rebecca Collins." Rachel smiled. "The new operations manager?" Rebecca nodded. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." Rebecca hesitated. "Has Walter always waited those 30 seconds at Maple Street?" Rachel laughed softly. "Oh, yes. For years." Rebecca expected criticism. Instead, Rachel smiled warmly. "When my son was born, I worked permanent night shifts." Rebecca listened. "There were mornings when the hospital was so busy, I thought I'd miss the bus." A small smile crossed her face. "But Walter always looked in his mirror just one more time." Rebecca asked quietly, "Did you ever ask him to wait?" Rachel shook her head. "Never. I always ran." Another pause. "He only waited if he could see I was already trying." That afternoon, she spoke with another passenger, a university student named Ethan. He laughed when she mentioned Walter. "I thought he was the strictest driver in town." Rebecca looked surprised. "Strict?" Ethan nodded. "He never waited if I overslept." Rebecca couldn't help smiling. "He didn't?" Ethan laughed. "No. He told me, 'Tomorrow your alarm clock needs to work harder than I do.'" Rebecca laughed aloud. "That sounds like Walter." Ethan nodded. "It taught me something. He wasn't rewarding excuses. He was helping effort." By the end of the week, Rebecca had spoken with a dozen regular passengers. Each story sounded different, yet everyone contained the same quiet pattern. Walter never guessed, never assumed, never played favorites. He simply watched. If someone was already doing everything they reasonably could, he found 30 seconds. If they weren't, the bus left exactly on time. That evening, Rebecca knocked gently on the driver's lounge door. Walter looked up from his cup of tea. "Come in." She sat opposite him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca asked, "How did you decide?" Walter smiled. "Decide what?" "Who to wait for." Walter thought for a long moment. Finally, he answered, "I never waited for people who weren't trying." A gentle pause. "I only waited for people who were already trying." Rebecca slowly nodded. She had expected a complicated explanation. Instead, she had been given one simple principle. Walter took another sip of tea, then quietly added, "You know." Rebecca looked up. When people are doing their best already, the last thing they need is the system making life harder. Silence settled gently between them. Rebecca looked down at her notebook, then slowly closed it. She smiled. "I think I've been measuring the wrong thing." Walter smiled back. He didn't ask what she meant. The following Monday morning, Walter arrived at the depot a little before 6. As always, he walked once around his bus, checked the tires, the mirrors, the lights, the wheelchair ramp. Everything was in order. Inside the driver's lounge, a stack of freshly printed timetables waited to be distributed. Walter picked one up without much thought. He glanced casually at Route 12, then stopped. He looked again. His eyes rested on one line. Maple Street, departure, 7:30, and 30 seconds. Walter smiled, almost imperceptibly. He quietly folded the timetable, placed it in his shirt pocket, then walked toward Rebecca's office. Her door was open. She was studying next month's schedules. Walter knocked gently. "You wanted to see me?" Rebecca looked up. "No." Walter smiled. "I think you did." He unfolded the timetable and pointed silently at Maple Street. Rebecca smiled. "I checked something." Walter waited. She continued. "For the last days, I watched. I listened. I asked questions." A small pause. "And I discovered you were never 30 seconds late." Rebecca held up the new timetable. The timetable was 30 seconds early. A gentle smile crossed her face. "Now the timetable is exactly on time." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Walter folded the timetable once more. "Thank you." Rebecca smiled. "For what?" Walter placed the schedule carefully back into his pocket. "For trusting 30 seconds." Rebecca looked thoughtfully out of the office window. "No." She shook her head gently. "For trusting what those 30 seconds were doing." Walter smiled. That morning, bus number 12 reached Maple Street exactly as always. The doors opened. Passengers climbed aboard. Several of the new Maple Heights commuters glanced at their watches, then toward the corner of Oak Avenue. 30 seconds later, Harold appeared, walking briskly with his cane. Walter smiled. "Good morning." Harold stepped aboard, then paused. He looked at the new timetable posted beside the driver's seat. He blinked. "You didn't." Walter grinned. "I didn't." Harold looked puzzled. Walter nodded toward the operations office printed at the bottom of the schedule. "She did." Harold smiled quietly, then found his usual seat. As the bus pulled away, he looked through the window. Far behind them, the little yellow school bus disappeared around the corner. He smiled to himself. Everything was exactly as it should be. A young man sitting nearby leaned forward. "Excuse me." Were you the gentleman everyone was waiting for? Harold chuckled. I certainly hope not. Walter answered before Harold could continue. We weren't waiting for Harold. The young man looked confused. Walter smiled into the mirror. We were waiting for what mattered to him. The bus became quiet. Even the new passengers seemed to understand. Several months later, Rebecca welcomed a newly hired driver named Daniel. She handed him the Route 12 schedule. He studied it carefully, then frowned. Maple Street. Why does this stop have an extra 30 seconds? Rebecca smiled. Come with me tomorrow. The next morning, Daniel sat behind Walter, watching, learning. At exactly 7:30, the bus stopped. The doors opened, then remained open. Walter quietly looked toward Oak Avenue. The little yellow school bus drove away. 30 seconds later, Harold appeared, exactly as he always did. Daniel looked puzzled. So, that's why we waited. Walter smiled. Partly. After the route had finished, Daniel asked Rebecca, couldn't we simply tell Harold to arrive earlier? Rebecca smiled. I wondered the same thing. She handed Daniel a small folder. Inside were 4 short notes. One from the nursing home, one from the local school, one from the transit planning office, one from Walter. Daniel looked up. Rebecca smiled. Leadership isn't always about asking people to adapt. A gentle pause. Sometimes it's about noticing when the system can. That evening, Walter parked bus number 12 for the last time before his annual vacation. He switched off the engine, collected his bag, then paused for a moment before leaving. He looked once more through the windscreen, toward the direction where he knew Maple Street was and Oak Avenue, toward the place where 2 bus routes and 3 generations quietly met every morning. He smiled, not because he had changed anything, because someone else now understood why it mattered. As he stepped off the bus, Rebecca called after him. Walter. He turned. She smiled warmly. I've been thinking. About what? She held up the timetable. I used to believe our job was to keep buses moving. Walter listened quietly. She smiled. Now I think our job is to help life keep moving. Walter's eyes softened. He nodded once. I couldn't have written a better timetable myself. The next morning, bus number 12 stopped at Maple Street. The doors opened. 30 quiet seconds passed. A little yellow school bus disappeared around the corner. Harold appeared and boarded the bus. Noticed Daniel instead of Walter. For just a fraction of a second, he hesitated. Daniel smiled warmly. Good morning. Rebecca and Walter told me 30 seconds are part of this route. Harold smiles, then simply says, Morning. The doors closed. The bus continued its journey. Exactly on time.